In this video I'll be building another price to performance PC build from used parts. This will have an AMD FX8300 CPU and RX460 GPU. As usual for these cheaper gaming builds, this will have 8 gigs of dual channel DDR3 RAM and an SSD paired with HDD for Steam or other games. Since this will have an octa-core CPU, which is quite power hungry, and no VRM heatsinks on the motherboard, I'm going to mount some cheap heatsinks on the motherboard VRMs. I got this motherboard as free junk essentially, and it doesn't have the IO shield anymore. In this case I've usually used these universal IO shields which you can cut accordingly, but it's usually been quite a pain to cut it correctly. This time I used a different method. I just pinched the universal IO shield mesh thing back there between the case and motherboard, and I outlined the ports with a pencil. This way the IO shield mesh was far easier to cut to correct measurements, and this way I was able to make much cleaner job than by just eyeballing and then cutting it. I used a 450 watt PSU with this, which sounds quite little for this CPU, but thanks to the very power efficient RX460 I measured the power consumption and it's perfectly fine to use this PSU for this build. This case had one 2.5-inch drive slot. I used that for the HDD since that needs to be more securely mounted than the SSD, which has no moving parts. I located the SSD at the top front of the case, and there was some screw holes that I used to mount it there. To get some RGB in this build, I did my usual trick and installed a 120mm RGB fan on the side panel with some rubber grommets. This fan is a bit weird because it has many RGB modes which it will continuously cycle through, and I don't know if there's any way to control it. There is this one Molex thing which needs to be inserted between the fan and the Molex power cable, or otherwise the fan will only light green and not spin like here. This is how the finished build looks like when it's powered on with the LED fan. I would personally use a fan that doesn't change its modes automatically like this, but otherwise I think it's quite fine. I tweaked BIOS settings a little and managed to clock the CPU to 3.8 GHz. With the CPU overclocked a little, the 3D Mark score is actually way higher than I expected, and it might make sense to pair this with a RX470 instead. With view distance set to medium and everything else lowest settings, it is very playable in Full HD resolution. This has been recorded with the AMD software. In CSGO, again in Full HD, really playable in Inferno with bots and using lowest possible settings. In Beamng.drive, which is a little bit more CPU intensive game, it performs surprisingly well for an old AMD CPU. During crashes, FPS drops down quite a bit, but it's still playable.